Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Ruda. I'm here with Agon, Hamza, and our guest for this second installment of the Crisis and Critique podcast. And I have the great pleasure to very briefly introduce our guest, who, and it's just such a common thing. It's even a common thing to say that it's a common thing, that he does need no introduction because he's one of the most influential, best known, most important thinkers, and I'm saying particularly thinkers because I don't think he's only known in philosophy, but he expanded the very realm of what we understand by philosophy in France and globally. Étienne Balibar. Etienne Balibar, and I'm doing this slightly inspired by one of his online web pages, graduated in philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure and the Sorbonne in Paris, 1964. He already came into quite some public, I think, visibility when he, as Althusser's pupil, as people know, with whom he closely collaborated at the École Normale Supérieure. He was also a fact that is rarely mentioned, but interesting in its own right, I think, expelled from the French Communist Party in 1981 for an article. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but nevertheless.
Say a word, but yes.
Okay. He has a PhD from Nijmegen in the Netherlands. That was 1987. Did his habilitation at Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne in 1993 and has been teaching all over the place. I'm talking Algiers, Paris 1, Leiden, Paris 10, Buenos Aires, UC Irvine, and Columbia University, New York. And not least, he obviously, as many of you will know.
And don't forget Kingston. And
exactly.
Don't forget
this is what I wanted
University.
To say. Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. No. You have the University of Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University. And you're still, if I understand, visiting professor there. I'm not going to list all the many publications and all the many books, but what I am going to say is that very recently, a collection of his writings, his écrits, has been published by La Découverte. 3 volumes, if I'm rightly informed, are out thus far. Histoire interminable, that was the first volume. Passion du concept, épistémologie, théologie et politique, that was the second one. And very recently, Cosmopolitique, which was came out this year. And last thing I wanted to mention is that all these volumes show the, let's say, variety and versatility of Balibar to move from a diversity of authors to a diversity of subjects, but it also shows, especially the Cosmopolitique version, how Etienne thinks it's time. I'm not even closet, but Hegelian cannot say if philosophy is nothing but it's time captured in thought, then one can see what this, what kind of labor goes into that capturing attempt, and what kind of pressure the times sometimes offer to come into the form of a concept. Balibar is, I think, for me, one of the best embodiments and manifestations of this. I now shut up and hand over to my friend, colleague, and collaborator Agon to raise the first of our questions and to start off our conversation. Thank you so much, Etienne, to be with us.
Thank you.
Etienne, it's a great pleasure and an honor for us to do this tonight. Okay, so we would like to start this conversation in medias res and immediately ask you about the contemporary situation. When you were a student, you protested against the war in Algiers, and in 1962, there were rather harsh police intervention against the protesters as well. So we were wondering, could you say a few things about the contemporary situation, the war in Ukraine as a determining feature for Europe these days? How is it different or analogous to the situation, let's say, in the 60s?
Thank you, Agon. Okay, hello everyone. Let me just say very, very briefly how pleased, how delighted I am to be talking to you tonight. This is an honor, and your kindness and your generosity make it also something very, very pleasant for me. And I hope it would be interesting for our listeners. Now, I will try and give you an answer on this first question. Perhaps our listeners, our auditors should know that you sent me in advance a long list of no less than 13 questions. And of course, I've been ruminating a little bit how I could answer each and every of them. I'm not sure if we have enough time because each of them is very substantial and difficult question, but I will do my best to give clear answers to you, and I leave it to you, of course, entirely to decide if you want to accelerate or if you want to bifurcate or move into the list of questions that you have prepared. Okay, so this being said, I find it funny that you begin like that for two funny and interesting for two reasons at least. One which concerns me in a very narrow sense, perhaps, which is that you, in a sense, ask me, even perhaps force me to draw a kind of parallel or establish a comparison or create a shortcut between something that traces back to the very beginnings of my adult life, I would say, or almost. I was still a student, of course, at the time, a very young student, and my commitments to a large extent trace back to that moment, and something which in the present, of course, is probably not the only question that calls, I would say, for our reflection and our responsibilities and our commitment, but which undoubtedly creates tension and places us before choices. I mean, which of course is also something that was the case at that time. But then the other reason why I find it a little intriguing, I would say, is that when people, and particularly people on the left, and perhaps especially people with a Marxist background, which is my case, I will not hide that, try and say something and think something about the current situation in Eastern Europe and the broader consequences and dimensions, I would say, of the war in Ukraine, the comparisons that more naturally come to mind and are comparisons with more recent episodes, I would say, and perhaps particularly almost forced to mention that because you generously alluded to the recently published third volume of my collected writings on cosmopolitique. There's a section in there in which I have collected several essays that I spoke or published in 2003 at the time of the American invasion, in fact, of Iraq. And when my volume came out, I was a little troubled. I thought, okay, there's a section on war in my volume and the implications of war and the very concept of war and the transformations it is undergoing in contemporary in the present. but these essays relate to a case and a situation which seems to be now completely overcome and transformed by the war in Ukraine. Except, of course, issues of imperialism, international law, sovereignty, the independence of nations, etc., are still more than ever at stake. Okay, so I'm already a little too long, but so I'll accept your suggestion because it also forces us, I would say, to seriously take into account one of the elements in the Ukrainian war that is very disputed, I would say, very contested. Incidentally, I wrote a long essay already several months ago. It was finished in early July and published in a French newspaper, an expanded version of the talk that I had given at the Birkbeck summer school. And so the short version was published. I was delighted with that. Was published both in English, Russian, and Ukrainian in a Ukrainian newspaper. And the more recent, longer essay, which I was trying to have published in English journals, was rejected almost everywhere. I mean, it was rejected by all the Marxist newspapers. Not newspapers, journals. I will not give you the names of these journals because they are the best known, and therefore you can easily imagine. So it was rejected everywhere. But finally, owing to the help of some friends, it's now available online on the website called Institute of Arts and Ideas. So if you're interested, you can go there. Now, the disputed question is whether the war that the Ukrainians are waging against the Russian invasion, which I believe, from the point of view of international law, is clearly a war of aggression. That doesn't exhaust all the characters of the situation, but it's legally impossible to deny. Whether this war also can be pictured as a war of liberation, I would say, on the side of the Ukrainians, and a colonial war or a quasi or post-colonial war on the side of the Russians. And this, of course, if this is the case, and I believe that it is the case to a large extent, which is disputable. I call the war on from a Ukrainian point of view, a war of independence. And I took in my paper, especially very quickly, 2 points of comparison. I said it could be compared with the war of independence of Ireland in 1919 against the British colonialism and imperialism. And it could be compared to wars of liberation in the 20th century, particularly the Algerian War of Liberation. So that suggests that, in a sense, the imperialist and colonial dimension of the Russian Empire that unfortunately returned into the history of the Soviet Union keeps forming, I would say, one of the dimensions of the Russian position or attitude. It's not the only cause of the war. I'm not denying that NATO was trying to not to invade, of course not, but to push back for many years the Russia into narrower borders and etc. etc. And we'll return to that. But it's this imperial and colonial dimension is very strong. And in a sense, what I wrote was a certain. Of course, I'm not speaking about the Russian people, but a certain part of the ruling elite, I would say, in Russia, which has mafia-like characters, etc., but is also a crystallization of a certain form of state power around Putin, is waging a kind of late colonial war in Ukraine. Now, this being said, it calls, of course, for a number of qualification. What this war demonstrates is that the question of empires is not, as surprising as it might appear, something that belongs only and entirely to the past. And that was very much the case as well, of course, in the war, unrecognized, never called as such, the war that the French were waging in Algeria in the 60s. And this is, if you like, this is of course a material dimension, but it's also an ideological dimension that is very important. Now, this being said, the paradox of the situation is that the war that is waged today in Ukraine by the Russians is taking place in an age, I would say, and therefore in an international or global situation, which is completely different from the one we had in the 60s. This was, I would say, at the time, the apex of the great movement of decolonization through armed conflicts and other forms of social movements. That was, in fact, completely changing, I would say, the face of the world in most continents, and with repercussions for us all. And as a consequence, of course, and this is this is an important aspect of the reasons why young students, Europeans like myself and so many others, committed ourselves to supporting the cause of the Algerian people. We saw it as another moment in a global, I would say, struggle in which the progressive, the socialist, not to say the and in fact the revolutionary forces would be on the rise, and with extraordinary prospects of dismantling the imperialist order. Of course, the main reason why young French citizens like myself and so many others in our generation, with nuances in the forms, in the ways in which we contributed to the protests and the anti-war movement, the main cause, of course, was the fact that as French citizens, we felt completely responsible, I would say, and directly responsible in the situation. My friend Jacques Rancière, who will return in the discussion, I'm sure, several times, because you think, and rightly so, that he's an important reference, has written a long time, sometime, I mean, a long time ago, an essay on the impact, I would say, of the Algerian war on us, with the title "La cause de l'autre," the cause of the other, in which he writes, we realized in a very concrete manner that emancipatory struggles are not always, and perhaps not mainly, fought in the name of one's own freedom, but they need to be fought in the name and for the sake of the freedom of others. And of course, this is all the more powerful if you find yourself on the side of the imperial or colonial power, and the freedom in that case is the freedom of the colonial subjects. But then there were other. When I went to Algeria after the end of the war in 1965 for 2 years as a young professor, I was imbued with the idea that Algiers would become something that the equivalent of Havana in the Eastern Hemisphere, and that. So now, to make a long story short, this, of course, is not the kind of background on which we can see the situation in Ukraine today. From this point of view, the difference is huge. The war in Ukraine is part, I would say, of the mess that is now created by the decline of the hegemonic empire, the rise of its competitors, of which China is clearly more important than Russia, but Russia is not negligible, and the destructive effects, I would say, on the what my friend Wallerstein would call the anti-systemic movements, or the emancipatory movements of the internal collapse, I would say, of socialist alternatives. So we are committed to supporting the independent struggle, I would say, of the Ukrainians. But we cannot not be wary of the consequences that this will have. And among these consequences, I believe that you want to return to this at some point in your question. There's, of course, the fact that the biggest imperialist alliance in the world, which is NATO, is momentarily, at least, considerably reinforced by this situation, and finds itself again on a, I would say, on a trajectory of expansion and domination. And this is especially the kind of the case in Ukraine. I wrote and I maintain that the Ukrainian war is an intra-European war, because culturally and historically, Russia, as was the Soviet Union, is part of Europe. So I wrote that this is a new episode of what several historians have called the European Civil War. But one of the immediate consequences, of course, of this situation is to have the western part of Europe, including perhaps Ukraine, we'll see, even more strongly and brutally, in a sense, subjected to the declining hegemony of the US imperialism. And so if you look at the situation in Ukraine, it's not too difficult, at least immediately, to take sides. Although many people on the left, the so-called campists, etc., don't want to do that because they are uninterested in history and only interested in abstractions about imperialism. But when you look at the larger, the broader consequences, of course, the situation is not favorable at all to progressive developments. That was too long.
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, we're going to stay with that period of time, and I think just to raise a question about maybe similarities and differences again, because you were involved with the youth group of the French Communist Party.
Yes.
And that right before events of May '68 and all that. That exactly the involvement of this youth group of younger people played a crucial role in moving the politics of the party, if we understand correctly, right, forcing it in a certain direction. Do you think there is some similarity, or is there an absence of exactly that factor today? I mean, is there? What do you think? Is there something to be learned from back then, or not?
Again, as I said, the conjunctures, the background, the situation are profoundly different. Profoundly different. I mean, of course, certain broad categories like imperialism, or on the other side, on the opposite side, and I know that you also, because I've read your questions, that you also want to come to that, internationalism are categories which I find which I found at the time, and I still find relevant and even decisive, Now the forms in the forms in which they crystallize, I would say, in precise commitments and even strategies, are very difficult to compare. I mean, I'm somebody who, if you force me to reflect on my own trajectory, so and perhaps the auditors will progressively realize that I'm somebody who moves permanently in contradictions. I don't know if I make good of these contradictions or not, but in this case, the contradiction is that I never wanted to drop, in a sense, any will qualify that perhaps, but any of the commitments that I took when I was a young man, 20 or 30 years old. And this is not just a question of pride or a point of honor, although I do believe that an essential dimension of political and ethical commitment is you don't retreat, or you don't turn your back, I would say, on the values that you have adopted, except if you are presented with absolute, undeniable evidence of the fact that they were wrong. So I have no evidence of the fact that to be an anti-imperialist, to be an anti-capitalist activist are wrong ideas and commitments. It's just the opposite. When I see the situation in today's world, when I try and imagine the world in which my grandsons will have to live, etc., I feel the same urgency, and I feel the same anger, in a sense, that moved me and us. I mean, at the time. On the other hand, and that's the dilemma and the contradiction, the idea that you could repeat the same slogans, you could apply the same strategies, you could keep analyzing the situations in which we are, and with what precisely the conjunctures, the present conjunctures reveal in exactly the same terms. We'll come to Marxism, of course, and so on, that you used 50 years ago strike me as absolute idiocy. I mean, and I'm sorry to say that in many of the, I don't have absolute certainties about what I say concerning the war in Ukraine, but when I read, and I will not give names, but there was an editorial recently in one of the best-known Marxist journals in this world, which discussed the many aspects of the war in Ukraine, and it seemed to me that this was repeating, just adjusting forms of analysis that have never changed since 50 or 60 years, and that's or even more. Now, to come to your very quickly to your specific point regarding my early commitment to and the relationship to the Communist Party. You are right. I mean, you are right. We ought to go into details. You might even wonder why a young man, less than 20 years old in 1960, I was 18 years old, and already taking part, as everybody around me, I mean, all the students at the left students at the Sorbonne and the École Normale, in the mass demonstrations, they were relatively massive at that time already, against the French colonial war, would become a member of the communist organization, because already at the time the problem was you don't have to caricature, but the problem was with the, I would say, the ugly or the dark combination of genuine revolutionary commitment and colonial prejudices and interests in a party like the French Communist Party. This was beautifully explained in a very, very famous, now extremely famous text that at the time was had already been written several years before by Aimé Césaire, the great Martinican thinker, philosopher, playwright, and revolutionary, in his who, after the discourse on colonialism, which is now considered a classic in every discussion of the history of anti-colonial thinking, preparing and making it possible for Fanon to write his own Wreck of the Earth and so on. And later, his letter to Maurice Thorez, the General Secretary of the French Communist Party, had explained that the French Communist Party was unable, in fact, not only for material reasons, but for deeply encrusted ideological reasons, and to effectively combine the anti-colonial and the labor struggle and the labor movement. And that, of course, became worse and worse with the time, in a sense. And when you said that I had been expelled from the French Communist Party, that's a personal episode that I will not go into detail. That was later, of course, in 1981, much later. But the immediate reason for that was that because I was wondering how it could be possible that a communist party based on the traditions of internationalism and work and solidarity among workers would support, in fact, racist demonstrations against immigrant workers and Africans and Algerians in the French neighborhoods. I wrote an article in which I said this, unfortunately, is not just a superficial phenomenon and a recent one. It traces back to the incapacity of the French Communist Party to fully and completely endorse the anti-colonial struggle. So the French Communist Party was against the war, but it was not 100% for the independence and the complete liberation of the Algerian people. Now, just little point that has to be added is that the situation was very different for the youth organization of the French Communist Party. In fact, I joined the youth organization because I had realized, rightly or wrongly, that you don't do politics without a strong organization. That was my conviction at the time. And in the demonstrations against the war, the organizations that were most active and efficient were the Students' Union in general, the Students' Union, yes, UNEF, and the Communist Youth Organization. But this led, this was even very, very remarkable because at the time, the labor unions in France were against the war, just like the Communist Party, but they never went as far as breaking the law, if you like, for that purpose. Whereas the UNEF, the Students' Union, did actually establish contacts with the Algerian National Liberation Front, and that was, of course, a very decisive move. So, of course, the Communist Youth Organization was on the same line, and for that reason, there was a very strong tension between the Youth Union and the party itself, which soon after that led to clashes and scissions and conflicts. But part of that, I anticipate something else, and I stop there. Because things are never very simple, was in a sense recuperated, I would say, and I don't hesitate to, by the anti-imperialist discourse coming from China. I mean, I never became a Maoist in the strict sense of the term, but many of my friends at the time, they became Maoists, and the decision they made against the Communist Party was following the instructions and the rules that they received from the Chinese because of this conjuncture I was telling you about earlier. Because they thought that the great alliance that had to be joined was the alliance between anti-colonial struggles and the great sunrise in the east, and that's another story.
Well, I'm sorry for this. Let's move to the 70s when
Okay. We haven't exhausted the 60s, but we must move to the 70s.
Yeah. No, because you wrote that the book, which was focused on the question or the category of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes.
Lenin famously said that there is either the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right. So
yes.
Could one say that such an either-or choice, a real choice where there is no neutral ground, so to speak, was important or significant in determining of your early, but perhaps even the later thought?
Okay, good question. And I'll read my notes, otherwise, otherwise it will be an hour again. You know, believe it or not, I'm not sure. I never, of course, try and check how many copies my books sell. But this book on the dictatorship of the proletariat almost certainly is the one among all the books I wrote that sold most copies, both in French and in foreign languages. And I'm, which seems unbelievable today. I mean, and I'm regularly asked, not in France, but from other parts of the world, why I don't republish it, you know, with possibly preface or postface in which I would explain on which points I think the same and on which points I disagree with what I had written at the time. I'll say something brutal, you know. I was manipulated by Althusser when I wrote that book. Yeah? And I know that this will create a problem for some listeners. So I need to qualify that. Of course, I was willingly manipulated by Althusser, of course. That is, I completely agreed at the time, not only because I was his student, I was his close collaborator, and we were struggling or fighting together within the Communist Party and the communist movement in general. In particular, fighting against something that in Althusser's mind had begun, in fact, with Khrushchev. That is the revisionist line of the Soviet Communist Party, followed by the French, of course. And here again, you can hear something like an affinity with the Chinese critique, and that culminated in a sense with the Euro-communist strategy advocated to some extent and in a very dubious manner by the French Communist Party, but especially by the Italian Communist Party. And in fact, I just wrote a postface or preface for a collection of Enrico Berlinguer's essays on Euro-communism and Europe, in which I revise my views of the time. Now, Althusser's position was a strictly orthodox Marxist-Leninist position, and that includes, of course, the what you call the binary or the either or choice, to which I come. Lenin is a complicated story, but the line that leads from Stalin to Mao, at least his official positions on this point, is the line that Althusser was following himself. So, of course, in the detail, he was trying to be a better theorist, in a sense, to add more intelligent reasons to that perspective and strategy, but it remained the same. And therefore, in a sense, when I look retrospectively at that, it falls, I have to admit, it falls under the critique that I was a moment ago addressing to a certain anti-imperialist stereotyped discourse that we observe today. Althusser's absolute conviction was that the concepts on which the foundation of the Third International and later the strategy of the Communist Party was something unshakable, something that could not be changed without losing at the same time the scientific and the revolutionary capacity of Marxist theory. And therefore, he had a tendency to see the history of communism, which is a tragedy. Of course, we all agreed on that, as a kind of permanent decline from the purity and the rigor of the concept, of the orthodox concepts. Now, how these concepts had been progressively elaborated and used in practice was not something that we ignored, but it was something that we considered to be a secondary. Now, in my book, I did something which I did several things, but which I do not regret. First of all, I tried to trace as accurately as possible a genesis of the formation and the transformations of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That led me, I will say one quick thing in a minute on that, to considering that the central issue was the issue of transition and political contradictions within the transition itself. Reason why I considered that Lenin's attempts at rectifying, I would say, the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat during the critical period of the so-called new economic policy was, in a sense, the core, the concentrate of the most significant and intelligent, I would say, content of the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And if I had continued on that way, of course, I would have probably moved away from the strictly orthodox position that Althusser was keeping and somehow imposing on us all at the time. I don't say that Althusser is reducible to that, but if you read, for example, something that has now been published, which is known as his conference, his lecture, his public lecture in Barcelona in 1976, you have a perfect illustration of that kind of schematic of schematism. Now, to finish, if possible, with that, I would say that there's an important source in Marx, of course, of this either or choice, which not only I would not reject, but to which I would gladly return. This is not only the idea of the antagonism, it's the idea, excuse me for a minute. Okay, this is not only the idea of the class antagonism, which, like it or not, is an either or choice, of course. There's a dominant class, there's an exploited class, or there are subalterns, if you like. But there's something more very striking in Marx's writings on the revolutions of 48 or later, the Paris Commune, which is something like a conflict between two concepts of sovereignty. And at the time, I had hadn't read a single line of Carl Schmitt, for example. So I didn't know that Schmitt's theory of the dictatorship is the result of his very passionate and accurate reading of Lenin, which he tries to reverse. But if I had known that, of course, it would have convinced me even more that the problem lies between two different types of sovereignty, and not in the same meaning of the term. The sovereignty of the state and the sovereignty of the revolution. They admit of no compromise, neither of them. And therefore, whether or not you adopt the strategic notion of the dictatorship of proletariat, you are caught, I would say, or you are forced to start again from that dilemma. Now, the other thing that I have to add to that is that the idea that underpins the trajectory leading from that alternative to the later elaboration of the dictatorship of the proletariat is very strongly linked also to the idea that is explicit in the Communist Manifesto, that the class struggle ought to be compared and in fact identified with the civil war. If you begin, if you return to the first sentences in the Communist Manifesto, it begins like that. All history until now was a history of class struggles, and they immediately, Marx and Engels, they immediately continue a civil war, either open or hidden or latent, that was terminated either through the victory of one camp or the mutual destruction of both. That's something very, very, very interesting. And of course, that's the difficult point. Marx himself, rather quickly, when he was writing his commentary on the history of labor struggles on the working day in Capital Volume 1, realized, and also because, of course, of the tragedy that the 48 revolutions had been, that the comparison with the Civil War needs to be qualified, not only in terms of the use of violence as the main or sole instrument of revolutionary struggle, but precisely because it leads, in fact, to a schematic representation of politics, including class politics, in terms of the formation of camps, which not only are antagonistic but are entirely separated from one another. And from this point of view, the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy is misleading, because Lenin himself didn't see the class struggle like that. At least in the period before the revolution and in the period towards the end, after the revolution, there is a sentence which I always found extraordinary, and at the time I was quoting it. He writes somewhere, but you can retrieve that in the 38 volumes of his complete work. He writes, the Marxist or the quasi-Marxist who sees the class struggle like this, there's one class which is on one hill. They establish their camp on one hill, and the other class is established their camp on the other hill. And at some point, they decide to fight the ultimate or final battle. So they go down from each other's side and they meet in the middle. So he writes, to such a representation of the class struggle is complete idiocy. Is complete idiocy. And in a sense, all of Althusser's efforts, I must now redeem him a little bit, around the notion of over determination was precisely a way of avoiding this schematic representation. So the antagonism does exist, but the separation never in history. Sorry.
No. Thank you so much. I think this is one can see how this bad representation might be actually very useful for Carl Schmitt, right? Somehow, but we're going to stay for a bit longer with Althusser, but maybe we move from, let's say, sidedness and antagonism to something which might be not antagonistic, or both antagonistic and universalist, because in your For Althusser, you And it has to do with the way in which you approach these questions, and maybe also locate your own position. For Althusser, you unfold the idea that philosophy has a very peculiar and strange present, because it's somehow everywhere as a kind of presupposition, is what you call an absent cause. Could we talk a bit about what it means for you that philosophy is there as an absent cause? What is the form of causation we're talking about when we're describing it like that? And maybe more trivially, how can we strategically even and conceptually mobilize that as a defense for, let's say, philosophy? I mean, philosophy departments. I mean, working in the UK, and you worked in the UK yourself, in times where maybe that are not necessarily fortuitous for the existence of philosophy programs.
I adopt a broad definition of philosophy. I mean, the problem with philosophy departments, and perhaps this is, no, that's not only the case in the English speaking world. Of course, in the English speaking world, most philosophy departments, I don't want to make any caricature. I know of important exceptions, of course, adhere to precisely to an orthodoxy. I mean, that is one method or one tradition. This tradition is called analytical philosophy. And as a consequence, they have extreme difficulties in really accepting that the so-called continental tradition in philosophy is philosophical in the strong sense, in the rigorous sense of the term. This is an absurd divide, of course, which has historical roots and that we could trace. So my point of view is, of course, that philosophy is discourse that is permanently divided. It has been so ever in history, and it remains so more than ever today, by something that with Foucault I would gladly call points of bifurcation or points of heresy in the etymological sense of the term. And the important stakes in philosophy, even in the most speculative sense of the term, are those which, in a sense, force you to once again borrow from antithetic sides. If we had time, I'd be very, for example, I'm increasingly convinced that the great speculative problem in the philosophical tradition that we need to address once again, and of course others would do the same, is the problem of so-called modalities. What do we mean by necessity, by contingency, and so on? And very interestingly, this problem is, in a sense, at the very heart of discussions and speculations, both on the analytic side, in the legacy of Goodman and Lewis and others who think in terms of multiple worlds and so on, and in the continental side, influenced by Marxism and phenomenology and existentialism, around the question of the event. I'm certainly on one side because of my training, but if I had time, I'd gladly move to the other side, at least for some time, in order to borrow instruments from there. Now, the other thing that I can say, and I come to the absent cause, is that philosophy is not, and that's also where the disciplinary limits are really disputable. I mean, a discipline called philosophy, which is not, I'd say, isolated, which from on one side, history, social sciences, anthropology is especially important these days, or literature on the other side. is nonsense. It's a creation. It's an institutional. Creation of the modern Western universities or academia. So I'm not saying that nothing important is done within those limits, but again, the important thing is to open the barriers and break the artificial differences. So I'll have occasions, perhaps in the continuation of this discussion, to invoke certain names which do not belong to the Marxist tradition. For example, Max Weber. Max Weber is a philosopher of primary importance in my view. And if you want to say something intelligent and concerning the relations between politics and philosophy, and so is Marx, of course, undoubtedly. And finally, philosophy has multiple styles of exposition, and that's where the analytic narrow representation is particularly damaging, I would say. But the kind of rhetoric, I would say, that has been imposed in the French academia, for example, is just as dangerous. Philosophers in the 17th century didn't write academic dissertations like today, and Nietzsche doesn't write like a professor of philosophy today. He writes in a poetic manner, and that's even the case for Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, etc. So philosophy has different styles, and as the institution, the philosophical institution, and more generally the academic institution in which you, both of you and myself and others, have been working until today, is progressively not decaying. I wouldn't say that, but is attacked and put in danger. For example, I learned yesterday that Birkbeck College wants, in fact, to cancel its Department of Philosophy, and some people are. So if these institutions are progressively eliminated, does that mean that philosophy as such cannot continue, and in a sense, but it will have to be recreated, perhaps in a different style? And now, to finish on your question about the absent cause, I, of course, I know where you take this from, and I salute my master Althusser after criticizing him for the extraordinary elaboration of that category in Reading Capital. So, as you may remember, of course, the absent cause is the immanent cause. So the question becomes, immanent to what? The formula, so you could say immanent to history, and at the beginning you said that you considered my activity as a good example of philosophical work as time captured in thoughts, and I accept that formula. I myself proposed in several passages in texts on Fichte, on Hegel, and others, the idea that philosophy is a discourse. I don't say discipline, but it's a discourse that elaborates contradictions in history and politics and society, but therefore these contradictions which have no or contradictions which do not have a pure philosophical origin or never pure speculative origin, but at the same time I thought I could grant, I would say, philosophy in general a capacity to formulate these questions in such a form that the extremities are reached, of the extremities of the antagonism. The reasons why they are not reconciled just by choosing the middle, the middle way. I also used another formula more recently, which I imitated from Quine's semantic ascent. I called it the polemic ascent. I believe that philosophy has a unique, or is justified, when it manages to elaborate and therefore, of course, make explicit the contradictions in the real in such a manner that their radicality is perceived or is conceptually expressed. And as a consequence, of course, the philosopher, whether knowingly or unknowingly, or consciously and or unconsciously, is a theorist who writes in the conjuncture. Philosophy is a combination of writing, Derrida is right on that, and dependency on the conjuncture. I believe that Althusser is right on that.
Well, you have to forgive us, but we're going to stick to Althusser for at least one more question. I mean, a question that you have gotten perhaps like a zillion times, but well, it concerns your relationship with Althusser. He seems to have been a somewhat peculiar version of what you yourself have called a point of no return. So what we want to ask you is, what is irreversible and what needs reversing after Althusser?
That's a very difficult question for me. It's a very difficult question for me because I cannot really separate the subjective dimension from the pure theoretical or objective dimension, if you like. So I'll return in a few minutes to the question whether there is something like an Althusserian theory. But suppose there is an Althusserian theory with more or less continuity and changes over time. I have enormous difficulties to adopt a view from outside, I would say, on that theory. And that comes from the fact that it's a biographic fact that Althusser began to write down and experiment, I would say, with his idea of a new version of Marxist theory or Marxist philosophy. He was even convinced that he would be able to create for Marxism a philosophy that had never existed. And perhaps this is a little delirant, but he's not the only one. A philosopher is always a little delirant. So he began to work on that with the essays that are published in the volume 4 Marx and later Reading Capital, precisely at the time when, with a group of others, of course, I'm not the only one, that is Macheret, Rancière in his early phase, and others we could name. Badiou is a special case because he was older, was a Sartrean. He was not immediately a member of that group, but which he joined later. So we were Althusser students. And so you might imagine that Althusser was somebody who would tell you, look, I have a theory, which is very strong, and I will try and convince you that you ought to take it or adopt it instead of being precisely existentialists like Sartre, or phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, I mean, the great name of the French philosophy at the time, or Bergsonians, or whatever. That was absolutely not the discourse that we received from Althusser. And that was not a ruse, a cunning on his side. He was absolutely sincere. He said to us, Marxism is badly in need of a philosophical elaboration that it never really elaborated and developed. Marxism, the official Marxism-Leninism is the wrong way. Of course, we at the time others were thinking more or less in the same manner. People in the Frankfurt School in Germany, or people in Italy, but let's keep our narrow for a minute French point of view. And he said, I don't know exactly, I have some hypotheses, but I don't know exactly what content this philosophy should find and assert. So we're going to work together in that direction. So as a result, there was no master and disciples. There was, of course, a senior, older member of the group who knew lots of things we didn't know, and younger people, but we all brought something. So as a consequence, and particularly the group of young students who were at the same time working with Althusser and with others, particularly Canguilhem at the Sorbonne, the great successor of the French epistemological school, we contributed ideas and formulations coming from diverse sources. So the result was a kind of common work or common creation in which Althusser had a leading role, but not an external role as a master. Or as a teacher, and I could never, in a sense, how do you say that? I could never escape from that situation. So for years, I might want to say, I might say, years now, I desperately tried to cut my tie to Althusser. And I believe that on a certain point, I did adopt problems and ideas, or consider problems which did not belong to his own problematic. So I was not a complete prisoner. But again and again, I realized in a sense that even when I was I believe that I was very far away from his questions. In fact, I was still ruminating and trying to elaborate some of his own ideas. Now, this leads me, I'm sorry if that sounds very subjective. I should, of course, take examples and the collections of writings that you mentioned a moment ago, and I'm now, of course, forced to think about what I'm going to put in the next volume. The third was on cosmopolitanism. The fourth is supposed to be on racism. Which is a difficult question, of course, a very present one. So that's a good example, because what came to my mind recently was the fact that I had never ceased to ruminate Althusser's questions about the category ideology. And therefore, of course, and I wrote that somewhere, and I'm not the only one, of course, everybody, Zizek, Butler, and many others, they keep returning to the ideological state apparatuses and the question of interpellation and so on. So I'm doing the same. So in a sense, I'm still caught in this problem, and I have a tendency to compare what you find in Althusser with what you find in others. In the past, that was Foucault, or that was Lacan, or that was Canguilhem, and now it is Butler, or it is others. But Because I had to write this collection, to assemble this collection of essays on racism, and because of the events from the past that you mentioned, and the war of Algeria, the origins of my commitment, the later episodes with respect to migrants and refugees, I had to ask myself the question, what would Althusser be able to say about racism? And I was led to the conclusion, nothing, nothing. But the idea that he has nothing to say about racism leads to the question and the worry. Isn't it the case that, in a sense, Althusser avoided the question of racism all his life, and in his theory? And the episode that prompted me to ask this question was the fact that recently a group of French psychoanalysts and activists working in the Paris northern neighborhoods or suburbs asked me to join a working group that they had created. And they said to me, we found in one of your old texts a very interesting formula. You said that racism is a psychic state structure psychique d'état. What do you mean by that? And so I had to admit that I had forgotten what why I had written that at the time. But it appeared to me as in fact an interesting formula that provides something like a kind of alternative. It's imitated, of course, from the famous Althusserian ideological state apparatuses, except that instead of ideology, you speak of racism, which is a practice. It's not, and above all, of course, psychic indicates a relationship to unconscious processes, and therefore psychoanalytic theory, that Althusser was continuously invoking and marginally addressing, but that in a sense he always eventually left aside. So that, this is enigmatic for the auditors perhaps, but the two questions: why did Althusser not elaborate his problem or his idea of the intrinsic articulation of ideology and the unconscious, that of course Zizek and so many others took, because they were Lacanians, if you like. And the question, why did Althusser not, why did he expel the problem of racism from his politics and his theory? These are not one and the same problem exactly, but there is something like a convergence or a common ground for both. So as you see, I try to illustrate. I'm trying to cut my ties with something in Althusser, but I return, perhaps in a critical manner, to the questions that he had raised. And the final point that I want to add to this is the following. Althusser is a troubled mind. Everybody knows that. And there's a dark and sinister side and a tragic side to his history. He murdered his wife. This is something that today would be called a feminicide in French, and there's no way escaping that. So that indicates that Althusser's folly is an important part, or madness is an important part of his personality. And of course, we might want, and I know many friends who want to go in that direction, and I'm not totally against that. Please make no confusion. On one side, there's the tragedy of the man, and on the other side, there are the more or less successful attempts at building a theory. I will not have the madness invade, I would say, what I say about the theory. But I want to rectify the idea that there is something like an Althusserian theory. Althusser is a man who reverses his positions continuously. He writes, so of course the initial formulations in 4 Marx and Reading Capital and a few texts after that are super. They are spectacular, spectacular moments of theory. And then after that, very shortly after that, 68 being, of course, a critical moment, which shaked every, for Althusser as for others, not only for him. Same is true for Deleuze, same is true for perhaps even Foucault. The ground is shaking under the theoretical construction. So he moves from one extreme to the other extreme. And that might appear so from the ultra theoreticist position, pure epistemological conception of Marxism towards a workerist and an activist conception of Marxism. So there's no such thing as a theory. There's a problem. And the problem is continuously re-elaborated, and it's re-elaborated under the influence of encounters. That's one of his late concepts, rightly taken seriously by many of today's readers, aleatory Marxism of the encounter, and so on and so on. You can rewrite the history of Althusser in the form of his encounters with people, with ideas, with situations. So an encounter with structuralism, a failed encounter with the Chinese Cultural Revolution through some of his students, a belated encounter with Machiavelli in the form of debates with Italian Marxism and so on. And there would be probably others. But the problem remains. And of course, I don't pretend that I can give simple formulation to that problem, but I tend, and here I have already mentioned that name. Perhaps I'll surprise you, but perhaps not so much. I recently reread Max Weber's 2 last essays on science as vocation and politics as vocation, which are extraordinary. And if you read them, I'm not far from I bow before that. You know. But what struck me was the fact that if you read them together, both of them contains a kind of dichotomy. The well-known dichotomy is the one between the ethics of conviction, therefore engagement, commitment, political partisanship, and the ethics of consequences, the ethics of responsibility. That's well known. On the other side, the side of science, there's a similar dichotomy, the dichotomy between specialized knowledge, or scientific knowledge, if you prefer, as a specialized exercise with objects. The society is not the same as the living, and the living is not the same as the cosmos, except that, of course, the boundaries are continuously put into question. And then the passion for truth. Which doesn't aim at specialization, but at totality, I would say. Now, the passion for truth and the partisanship and the political and the passion for politics are really the two, I would say, driving forces in Althusser's thinking, as they were, in fact, already in Marx and some others. You must throw yourself into the emancipatory or political struggles of the time. But at the same time, you keep the passion for truth, which is never completely compatible with the first. Spinoza's motto, but we need to understand, sed intelligere. It's the combination and the clash, of these two passions that drive Althusser permanently. And from that point of view, not only I admire him, I respect him, but I must admit that I'm still in his tracks.
Thank you so much for this. We're skipping one question. I suggest that we approach one concept, one of your famous concepts, because for you something absolutely politically significant happened with the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens, and
yes,
because it introduced something like 1789, this revolutionary declaration introduced something like a dialectics of freedom and equality that has a bearing for your conceptualization of equal liberty, egal liberté, right? And that makes the other side, before we return to racism soon. This is a positive vision that we get there. Could you say more about this? Can you? What is that bearing? What happened with that declaration and its universalist dimension? And
there's a text in which I propose a distinction, and it's been proposed by others, sometimes in a slightly different terminology, between what I call extensive universality and intensive universality. So extensive universality, of course, applies to a discourse or a system of ideas that seems to be meaningful and even necessary for anyone in the world. So, Frank, you are invisible now suddenly. Doesn't matter, but okay. So there's no doubt that the discourse of human rights, or the rights of man in its initial formulation, very interesting. As it was progressively elaborated, I would say, towards the end of the 18th century in Europe and America, North and South, and then, of course, declared and as a consequence institutionalized in some Western republics, rather than democracies, but republics, has been again and again presented as a universalist, as an expression of universalism in the extensive sense of the term. And the consequence of that, which is of course a very dubious one, is the fact that it could also, like other universalisms in history, Christian universalism or Jewish Christian universalism or Jewish Christian Muslim universalism in particular, but there are probably other examples. It could be used politically, not only as an instrument of liberation or emancipation, but also as an instrument of domination, and particularly in the form of claiming, I would say, that the very language in which it is formulated is understandable and acceptable from within any culture the world. And then the question of culture is itself overdetermined, of course, by the fact that historically some cultures are dominant and others are dominated. And therefore, in a kind of second degree movement, some cultures are supposed to be more universal than others. That is not the case for all cultural anthropologists and cultural theorists. I mean, the tradition that comes from Humboldt and leads to a certain aspect of contemporary multiculturalism doesn't say that. But the colonial tradition is and the imperial tradition weighs very heavy in that respect. So now, of course, that leads to a kind of counter move, which we observe, which is also driven by political interest on the side of domination, not on the side of emancipation. That leads to the idea that the categories, liberty and equality, with their immanent or inherent tension, which is what my code word or my portmanteau category, equal liberty, wants to capture. It doesn't want to capture an identity. It wants to capture a problem and a tension. So that leads to the idea that these are Western categories, that these are bourgeois categories, which can be used only from the point of view of the perpetuation of the dominant forces. Marx himself, of course, went into that direction, and the kind of discourse that he proposed, for example, in famous passages of On the Jewish Question, is continuously formulated and adapted again in that sense. This is not Marx's last word. This is not Marx's, or this is not Marx's only word. The other aspect of Marx's theory, which is, I believe, of a very great importance today, is the one that is contained in the idea, not the idea of the unfinished revolution, but the idea of the permanent revolution, the movement that radicalizes the struggle for liberty and equality, or for equal liberty, into the problem of social domination, and therefore also, of course, other forms of domination. The core of the problem in the critical analysis of the declarations of rights is, of course, to be associated with the category property. The extent to which property can be considered a fundamental right of man and the citizen is the crux of the problem, and this is more actual than ever. Now, I distinguished from that extensive use what I called an intensive use of the meaning of the idea of universalism. And again, we might want to take several examples, but I limit myself to the following remarks. First, intensive universality is not a notion which claims to describe a validity for the whole world. In a sense, it is totally indifferent to that problem of extension. It describes the problem, the political problem arising in whichever group or community or institution where individuals and possibly groups establish a political regime or a political institution. So reason why I argued that the core of the declaration was not a separation of the rights of man or the human on one side and the rights of the citizen on the other side, as perfectly clear in other examples, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which puts the human rights on one side and puts the political authority of the states untouched on the other side. I said this is one and the same problem, and the problem is whether you have governing, you have rulers and ruled by nature or by tradition, and whether you have privileges for one part of the population and not for and no rights for the other one. It's the Arendtian problem of the right to have rights. How is the right to have rights distributed in a given community or polity? And the consequence of adopting this point of view is not only that you combine or that you reunify the question of the citizen and the question of the human. It's also the fact that you have to adopt with respect to the notion of rights or fundamental rights, the point of view of infinity, I would say, or the point of view that says that the content of the rights is not formulated once forever, and it's not limited to the rights, the political rights, for example, or the social rights that have been recognized at some moment, because in fact an insurrection took place that formulated them and asserted them and imposed their validity. This combination is always the result of insurrectional moves, and new insurrectional moves take place in other places and at other moments of history. In the dispute that in France was so virulent, I would say, at the time, because of what was taking place when I wrote that essay on equal liberty for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And of course, I have to admit that there's a great danger that I'm much too French in that respect, but I also try and not be completely dominated by that point of view. The question was whether the notion of a politics of human rights made sense or not. And the background of that was humanitarian interventions, human rights movements in Eastern Europe, Solidarność, and so on. So the idea that there existed a politics of human rights was defended by a French philosopher who at the beginning was absolutely not on the same side as myself. That was Claude Lefort. Claude Lefort was a Trotskyist. He was a member, an important member of the group Socialism and Barbarity. He was a disciple of Merleau-Ponty, and Althusser and Lefort had a common interest, which was Machiavelli's political theory, but they did not think the same. At the time, I thought that Lefort was right in this dispute, that is, in asserting that there does exist a politics of human rights, because Lefort was explaining that the ensemble, or the list, if you like, of fundamental human rights is not closed. So he associated what I myself called intensive universalism with an invention of new human rights, and an assertion of these new rights against, of course, the institutional forces which prevent them from being recognized. So I decided to stand on that side, and I tried to apply it in my own elaboration of the category. But if you return, and I'd finish with that, if you return to the originary moment, I would say, that is the time of the American and French revolutions. That is the time where the place where you need to return to always again restart the Marxian process of permanent revolution, including, of course, because you need to very strongly preserve the democratic values against the degeneracy of socialist and communist politics. If you return to the original moment, the very striking fact, which can be symbolically encapsulated in the names of Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft on one side and the Haitian Revolution on the other side, is the fact that they read the Declaration and they immediately realize that the Declaration has a potential of development beyond the bourgeois and also, of course, colonial and masculinist limits. So reason why they write a Declaration of the Rights of Women, or which will become later other things, Declaration of Sentiments and so on. Or they write the Constitution of Haiti, which in fact says if the rights of man and the citizens are to be considered universal values, then slavery is impossible and cannot be justified. And insurrection and rebellion against slavery is completely justified. And this is the movement, the revolutionary movement that is implicit in the Declaration itself, the Black Jacobins, if you like, in C.L.R. James's formula. So the tension is there at the very beginning, and it will never end. But that might also involve a necessity to reformulate the rights. I never considered that the formulas in the French Declaration are absolutely valid. They're not absolutely valid. The only thing that I'm trying to suggest is a new formulation is useful and even indispensable only in as much as it invents, in the first sense, a new system of rights that is broader than the first. And of course, much of the post-colonial debate today, which includes relativizing some of the formulations in the French or American text, or much of the debate today about the commons and the exploitation of nature, which force us to reconsider our definitions of property, and therefore and even the definition of the property of individuality as property of oneself in the bourgeois tradition. This is part of the same movement. Wow, where are we? Do we still have time for one or two questions?
What we
Not
propose
everything.
is that we maybe switch to the last one,
yes,
which contains a couple of questions in itself. Would you be okay with that? And
which one?
Which the 13th, one? The last
the
question,
13th. The 13th. Yeah. Okay. So we leave aside racism, etc. I was too long, and race, nation, and class. Okay. The new racism. I ask you to wait, and I will try for the publication of my fourth volume of collected writings, Écrit, whose tentative title, but it's been announced already, will put me in a very uneasy position. Because in French, I call it l'avenir déracisme. This is a formula that I borrow from Lacan, in fact, or indirectly at least. But of course, it involves a double question, which in your written text that I received, you very clearly indicate, and which in a sense is in the continuation of the work that I did with Wallerstein on race, nation, and class. On one side, the racism that we know, which is complex, of course. It's largely, but not exclusively, a post-colonial racism with deep roots, in particular in slavery, anti-Black racism. But it's more complex than that, also because anti-Black racism has, that's something that sometimes writers on the side of so-called Black Marxism have difficulties to admit it has roots which are not in Western colonization. It has roots which are in the Arabic Muslim conquest of part of Africa and other things like that. Very disputed question. But in any case, this, and it's complex as well, because I increasingly believe, and I defended that idea in particular in a conference at Bard College several years ago on anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is, of course, intersects with racism. But this was particularly the case, of course, at the time of the Nazi, but also the ideology of biological differences among races. But that was not only the case in Nazi Germany, it was largely adopted in the US, in Europe as well, etc. Nevertheless, despite this intersection, anti-Semitism has roots in a religious conflict which is not directly linked to colonization. And Islamophobia today, at Bard, I said the question cannot be only about racism and anti-Semitism. It has to be also about Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, like anti-Semitism, might seem to be essentially rooted in religious conflicts and divergences, but it's a completely different history. So the first question is what is the future of these forms of racism? Are they bound to disappear? Why are they continuously returning? If you want to be a little polemic, you might want to say, unfortunately, they seem to have a bright future. But the other question, which is completely different, is whether other forms of racism or new forms of racism are emerging or bound to emerge. And of course, in this respect, the link with contemporary forms of nationalism and xenophobia against migrants, refugees, and others are important, but this is a very enigmatic and important point in my view. Okay, so we skip that, and I ask you to wait until I to know my
then
opinion.
maybe we can meet again and discuss the book and all this.
And now we come to question number 13. So would you like to?
So it is. Let me just explain what we mean. Like for the it's like we thought of it as a short as a series of short questions which are either
yes.
or.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so let me begin. Can I?
Yes.
Lenin or Marx?
Agon, I've read the questions. So I know that after this first one, I know that you want to put me before the wall, and I will not back. But they are all in the forms of such of dichotomies, X or Y, with names of great philosophers, theorists, political thinkers. So which seems to suggest that I should choose my side, that it should choose my side. And you know enough about me now to understand that I You could put it like that. I'm uneasy with such choices, and I've been reproached by so many of my good friends. But you always says to me, "Oh, you've become such a conciliatory thinker. Facing great choices, you avoid them." So you could put it like that. I'm uneasy with choices, but you could also I would also put it in the following manner. Each time you are faced with a dichotomy of that type, the main question for me is what is left, what other possibility is left outside. Of course, in the same, more or less, in the same realm or in the same range of issues. It's a deconstructionist attitude. I never mentioned Derrida today in our conversations, but he, on certain points, I'm very influenced by him. So now we can proceed, because what I'm going to do is not choosing, but each time proposing a third name.
I like this. I think Frank likes it as well. So
okay, so Lenin or Marx?
Yeah.
Perhaps both, and on different subjects, one rather than the other. But the third name I want to introduce here is Max Weber, for the reasons that I alluded to before. Now, I'm not a nationalist like Max Weber. I want to be a communist like Marx. Hegel, that's a different case. But with respect to the articulation of politics and history, I think you cannot leave him aside. Go ahead.
Marx or Hegel?
Lenin, that was Lenin or Marx, and that was Lenin or Marx.
Yeah.
Yes. Or I thought it was Marx or Hegel. No, excuse me, Lenin or Marx, we are confused. Lenin or Marx, I would say the third would be Gramsci.
Okay. So Marx and Hegel.
And I tell you why in one word. Because Gramsci until the end was haunted by the question that he called the question of passive revolutions. Lenin and Marx never envisaged passive revolutions. Now, passive revolutions can be fascist, they can be Soviet type. China today is a fantastic and frightening example of a passive revolution from above. From above. Okay, so that was his question. Then your next alternative, I let you continue, but which I confused with the first, was Marx or Hegel. And then I would say the third is Weber.
Weber. So then, Hegel or Spinoza?
Descartes, my dear.
Well,
of course.
All right.
Hegel or Spinoza is a great point of heresy. This is absolutely fundamental. Deus sive historia on Hegel's side, the divinization of history. Deus sive natura on Spinoza's side, the equivalence between nature and the divine under the name eternity. But then Descartes, and here you might argue, that comes later, you might argue as a good Lacanian would do, as a good Lacanian. Lacan was the only one among the structuralists of the time who not only did not reject Descartes, but continuously, of course, he proposed a new interpretation of the formula, I think, therefore I am, and so on and so on. But he insisted that the question of the subject had roots in Descartes that could not be eliminated. And I would add today, that's one of my interests, that contrary to the, I do it quickly, contrary to the Vulgata, I mean the vulgar understanding of Descartes that is particularly insistent in the analytic tradition of the Anglo-Saxon reading, where Descartes is supposed to be the arch theorist of dualism. The body on one side, the mind on the other side. The one thing that is crucial in Descartes is the fact that he does not remain with the body mind dualism, but continuously writes on the problem of their intersection or intermingling, which he calls the union, the third substance. And that's, of course, the question of the passions, and that's the question that Spinoza also addresses, but after Descartes. And that's the question, above all, of these this category of thoughts or impressions that you cannot attribute either to the influence of the body or the influence, the pure the intellect of spirit, because they are in fact exactly located at their intersection. So Descartes is imprescindible.
Okay,
Fourth.
so I will Freud or Lacan?
More than ever with the previous ones, I have to admit that I don't see a possibility to choose. I'm not a psychoanalyst, and I'm not a theorist. I've written a few texts on the articulation of psychoanalysis with law, Freud and Kelsen, and other things. And I was telling you a moment ago that I'm now ruminating something about psychic state formations or apparatuses, which takes me back into that direction. But I think that Lacan misses something that is in Freud, and Freud misses something that is in Lacan. So that's the whole problem. But if you want to add a third, if they can be reduced to the same, I'm with the structuralist Lacan against the evolutionist Freud, and I'm with Lacan's with Freud's understanding of the death drive against its sublimation in Lacan, or some of Lacan's texts, at least I would say. But then, of course, there are others. There are others, and the name that quite inevitably comes to your mind is Foucault, of course. So the whole question would be: can you deal with issues from within the psychoanalytic corpus if you don't introduce a critical point of view that is rooted in Foucault's deconstruction, I would say, of the concept of sexuality itself? And the answer is no.
And the very last one is revolution or reform.
You think you'll catch me in that?
No.
It depends on how you define that. But I'll just say two things because I have to be quick. First, I argued in the concluding chapter of a little book called Citizenship that is published by Polity Press that Edward Bernstein's infamous formula, das Endziel ist nichts, die Bewegung ist alles. The final goal is nothing, the movement is everything, which is supposed to be the epitome, I would say, the mantra of a reformist politics. And that's what, of course, Luxemburg, Lenin, every radical Marxist has been arguing against for more than one century. I argued that this was, in fact, or that this could be used and interpreted exactly as a perfect synonym for Marx's definition of communism in the German ideology. Communism is not a future state or regime that we aim to install or create. It is the movement that abolishes or overcomes the famous German category, Hegelian category of Aufhebung, the existing state of affairs or regimes. It's the same idea. So the whole affair now comes, of course, to the understanding of what you call movement, movement in the present, in the actuality. And the choice between revolution or reform, independent of the word, of course, depends on whether you accept the idea that insurrections are necessary. I mean, that without insurrections, there are no radical historical change in whichever domain. So at the end of my first volume, I proposed a kind of summary of discussions about socialism and socialist transition or socialist transposition, in which I said, in the world of today, given on one side the environmental catastrophe and other catastrophes as well, in fact, and on the other side, the apparently unstoppable increase of inequalities and differences, both between class differences, both between the North and the South, and within each of our societies, between the extreme wealthy and the mass of the poor. The three types of strategies that we need are regulations, because I don't see any possibility to address the issue of the environmental catastrophe without global regulations, which involve, of course, state policies and initiatives. Insurrections and utopias, or if you prefer, concrete utopias, that is, experiments in alternative ways of life, of living together and with respect to nature. But at the core of the triad, which is just an enumeration, there is the insurrection. So either the insurrectional moment is involved in your understanding of Bewegung, movement, or it is excluded. If it's excluded, it's reformism in the worst possible sense. If it's included, it's revolution. But revolution is not the final apocalyptic Armageddon when the two camps descending each from their hill will fight the final battle.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Etienne, thank you so much for this. It was.
It feels almost, or directly, not almost, as if this needs to be continued.
I don't hear you.
Frank, you have some issues with your yeah. You have to come closer to the microphone for some reasons.
Oh, okay. Sorry. No, I couldn't. Just meant this feels as if this needs to be continued. This is another histoire interminable, maybe, hopefully. But we will see each other in the future, I hope. Thank you so much for all this.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
And
thank you so much.
I dare to say thank you, auditors and future listeners. If you don't drop before the end, if that's not too boring.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Take care. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good evening.
You too.